Mike, can I jump in for 1 second before you go on? I just thought something curious about, you were talking about, being treated like a heretic, which I think is an interesting word because, as you said at the beginning of the show, this has become a state religion, this whole environmental thing, and that's how we would treat somebody in a religion as a heretic if they're questioning the dogma.
Well, that's right, and it's fine. It's sad that science has become treated. It used to be that science was very much what do the facts show and what does your data show. Well, basically now anyone says that, and I highlight this article, a lot of people are being shunned because of this, because it jeopardizes the funding that comes as a result of climate change research. So in other words, I think the probe heretic sometimes seems to be appropriate because it does threaten that flow of research money. So what I was going to say is that the problem with the public policy based on this alarmism is very hard to sustain. And I have three reasons for that. One of them is overselling the crisis, which I think has happened now. I think the general public is becoming very numb and cynical to this endless barrage of ills that are all tied to global warming. And there's a real funny one I found here that it says, I'll share this with your listeners. Despite having hundreds of sonar contacts over the years, the trail has since gone cold. And Nessie, that's the Loch Ness Monster, may be dead, a victim of global warming. So, everything can be tied, every problem, it seems to be tied to global warming.
Gotcha.
The other reason that it's hard to sustain this is because evidence to the contrary. What's interesting is in the 1970s, we were all concerned about global cooling at that point. In fact, there were headlines over and over that was the big threat to the world. Well, when evidence to the contrary, for example, got warm, it's hard to sustain that. Well, that's what's happening now. Actually, we're seeing cooling is taking place, so it's hard to sustain that. And the other one is when it gets run over by a real crisis. It's nice we have the luxury to be worried about crisis of global warming, but they did a Pew survey poll. It had 20 issues that people were concerned about, and global warming came in dead last of the concerns that the American people have. The top 5 were the economy, jobs, terrorism, Social Security, and education. So unfortunately, we're still trying to push this. So now it's climate change, and we have this Copenhagen conference coming up in December, which is going to kind of Kyoto 2. But you've got to wonder about the thought process of these people to have a climate change conference in December. I think that's kind of risky to do that. That might turn out to be rather embarrassing. The other point I want to talk about is the carbon dioxide issue, which the news media, politicians, and everyone else has demonized. And I almost feel like writing another article about in defense of carbon dioxide. If we look about remember one of my points about policy formulation was what is 100% and what part are we concentrating on? If you look at the atmosphere, what is it composed of? You have oxygen and nitrogen. Those are 78% and 20% respectively. That brings us up to 98% of the gases are those two elements. The remaining 2% is made up of argon and methane and all. So then that leaves us down to 1% for these global warming gases. So now we need to figure out, well, what percent of the global warming gases is carbon dioxide? Well, it turns out that of all the global warming gases, we should only talk about 1%, carbon dioxide makes up just a fraction of that. The biggest global warming gas, which nobody wants to talk about, because it distorts, it downplays the severity of this global warming problem, it's water vapor. 95% of all greenhouse gases is composed of water vapor. So as a result, carbon dioxide is a very minor component of greenhouse gases, but it's the only one that man may have some part in playing. But as it turns out that the majority of the carbon dioxide is actually of natural origin anyway. So for us to be concentrating on this, if we put this in perspective about how minor and insignificant it is to the overall amount of gases and greenhouse gases, I think that's somehow that gets lost. The thing that I feel is the biggest contributor to warming or cooling is the sun. And what's happening interesting now is the sun activity has become very much decreased of late, and it's because the sunspot activity has gone down. So there's a much higher correlation of temperature on the Earth with solar activity than there is with carbon dioxide. I think that's always been missed in a lot of these things, and I just want your listeners to know that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to end on, Mike. Because you've done a really good job, I think, putting this into perspective, what we're actually dealing with. Mike, I want to thank you so much for being on today. This has been really interesting. We'll have to get you back again sometime to talk about some of your other articles. And let me go ahead and tell my listeners you've been listening to Free Markets. I'm Mike Beitler, your host. My guest for these first three segments today has been Mike Heberling. And if you want to read some more of Mike's articles, I recommend going to the Freeman, and he has about a dozen articles there on a variety of topics. I think